Released in 1999, the Nikon D1 was Nikon's first in-house digital SLR camera, and arguably the world's first practical digital SLR. It largely resembles today's pro-grade cameras, but in comparison to its modern counterparts, it's fairly quirky in its operation. In this video, we're going to go over the D1 and D1H and compare it to the D2 and D3 series of cameras, as well as the mirrorless Z9. First, a brief history lesson. As I mentioned earlier, the D1 was released in 1999. Less than 2 years later, in early 2001, improved versions of the D1, the D1H and D1X, were introduced. Just 2 years after that, in mid-2003, the D2 series of cameras started to arrive on the scene. Following 4 years of D2 series of cameras, the D3 was introduced in mid-2007. There are numerous similarities between the D1 and Nikon's subsequent flagship cameras. All of the major elements are in roughly the same place. The screen on the back with a control panel below it, a drive mode dial with extra buttons above it, a top screen just behind the shutter button, front and rear command dials, a play button of sorts, and a delete button in the top left of the back of the camera. Nikon has even stuck to circular eyepieces for the viewfinder on their flagship cameras. However, there are lots of differences in its operation. While the D1 does have a basic setup menu, unlike today's cameras, more complex custom settings had to be configured through an unintuitive numbering scheme on the rear control panel, located under the main screen on the back. For example, custom settings 28, set to 1, enables the option to select the RAW file format. And although you can review images without switching to this mode, it also features a dedicated play mode on its drive mode dial, with the only difference being that in play mode you cannot take photos, and the buttons below the screen change to the play mode functions described on the door hinge. Although Nikon had advertised that the D1 contained a 2.7 megapixel sensor, around 7 years after its release, Nikon revealed that it actually has a 10.8 megapixel sensor pixel binned down to 2.7 megapixels to improve its noise characteristics. The D1H features the same sensor with improved image processing, and the D1X bumped up the megapixel count to 5.3. With this iteration, on top of improved image processing, we see a much improved menu system that begins to resemble modern cameras, and the buttons were slightly rearranged as well. Since the introduction of the D2 series of cameras, things haven't really changed much in terms of menu layouts and handling. The buttons under the little metal flap on the D1 evolved into a much easier to use layout, with larger buttons lining the side of the rear screen and below the larger rear control panel. Interestingly, while the original D1 had the ISO button on the rear control panel, the D1H and D1X moved it to the top of the drive mode dial. With the D2 series, the ISO button returned back to the rear control panel. The screen got much bigger and became much better integrated with the camera body. Playback is no longer on the drive mode dial. The grip ergonomics, especially in vertical orientation, is much improved. Voice memos can now be recorded against an image. Anyone used to a modern Nikon DSLR or a Z series camera can pick up a D2 series camera and use it without too much thought. The D3 was introduced in mid-2007, and this was Nikon's first full-frame digital SLR camera. It was also the first to feature a CMOS sensor, which enabled live view capability. However, this was a little bit clunky in its operation. Rather than being able to switch it off and on with a button press, it was a dedicated drive mode on the dial. And switching to it, it required 2 shutter button presses, the first one to turn on live view, and another to take the actual photo. Skipping all the way to late 2021 with the Z9, Nikon's first flagship mirrorless camera, we see many of the same elements but with significant changes to its button layout, even compared to the last flagship digital SLR from Nikon, the D6. Sadly, with the Z9, we have lost the rear control panel, and the memory card door has become like other non-flagship cameras, although for a good reason. This extra space allows the camera to be smaller, and the buttons have all been rearranged to prioritize the ability to access all of the common functions with your right hand, so you can keep supporting the lens with your left hand, or even shoot one-handed, and still be able to review images and change all of your exposure settings. The rapid development and improvement of these cameras in the early 2000s is amazing to me, and I've had a lot of fun using these older cameras for the past month. Back in 2007, I'd always dreamed about owning a D3, but I never thought I'd actually end up picking one up. Alright, that's it for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this quick look and comparison at Nikon's earliest flagship digital SLR cameras. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.